Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Heritage and Colonialism Discussion Group's 2023-2024 program, It's Complicated. This year's sessions seek to reclaim the phrase It's Complicated as a tool for unraveling nuanced colonial issues surrounding heritage throughout time. To this end, today we host an It's Complicated panel discussion on walking tours. We would like to warmly welcome our panel speakers, Ranjini Nair of Uncomfortable Cambridge and Mahnoor Fatima. Ranjini Nair is a Kuchipudi dancer and doctoral researcher at the University of Cambridge. She works as a research assistant for Uncomfortable Cities and is a senior guide with Uncomfortable Cambridge, an academic-led social enterprise that runs discussion-based walking tours centered on tackling uncomfortable and complicated local histories. Mahnoor Fatima is a cultural heritage and community engagement specialist with a master's degree from Pratt Institute. She's currently an organizer at the Pakistan Collective for Decolonial Practice and a board member of the South Asian Women's Creative Collective. We shall begin with Ranjini's presentation, followed by Mahnoor's. So Ranjini will be presenting on Uncomfortable Cambridge, confronting complicated local histories through discussion-based tour. Welcome, Ranjini. Please take the floor.
Hi, Isabella. Thank you so much. And thank you, Ria, for having Uncomfortable Cambridge on this platform. I'm going to, well, you've already introduced me, but yeah, my name is Ranjini and I'm a fourth year PhD student. My research actually deals with something quite different, with Indian classical dance, in fact. However, I have been working with Uncomfortable Cambridge for the past year as a tour guide. And I've also been working as a research assistant for their R&D for the past 6 months. And I'm very excited to share what Uncomfortable Cambridge does and hopes to do in the future, as well as its sister/parent organizations, however you wish to call it, Uncomfortable Oxford and Uncomfortable York. And yeah, could we move on to the next slide, please? So, Uncomfortable Cambridge was founded in 2022 with a social mission. And this mission was to raise awareness and create informed discourse about uncomfortable aspects of our shared history in the city of Cambridge. Our mission is to collaboratively challenge Britain's role in creating the uncomfortable histories and legacies of privilege, power, inequalities, imperialism, and discrimination. We provide opportunities for research-informed public dialogue that questions established narratives and breaks down institutional barriers in order to advocate for justice and accountability. How did this begin? It began in 2018 at the University of Oxford as Uncomfortable Oxford to address the lack of discussion which was happening in the city landscape at the time. It's also to try to look at the overlap between history and memory and what comes out of that interaction. We try to champion, or we try to platform contested histories as well as hidden histories in order to engage in a public dialogue with the participants of our walking tour. And we're also interested in how these public debates then go on to shape history. We also try to recenter oral history in some of our projects to talk about how some voices tend to be heard more than others. So, like I mentioned, the organization began with Uncomfortable Oxford in 2018. We moved to Cambridge in 2022, so it's been a little over a year here, a year and a half. And York began very recently in 2023. Could we move on to the next slide? So, we're a social enterprise. This means that in addition to our tours, Uncomfortable Cambridge also develops educational tools to facilitate further conversation in a diversity of contexts, including lesson plans, research articles, workshops, and other outputs. Uncomfortable Cambridge regularly organizes free public events in order to bridge gaps between universities and the local communities. The profits generated by Uncomfortable Cambridge's activities are redeployed into outreach activities and partnerships which uphold its social mission. So as funding, we've had AHRC doctoral training partnership placements, and we've had research collaboration with institutions and festivals. We run on a social enterprise model which champions sustainability and advocates for paid work opportunities, as well as community investment. Could we move to the next slide, please? So as an organization, we run a variety of activities. We have 4 walking tours in Cambridge currently ongoing. The first is the original tour, which introduces you to a range of uncomfortable histories that look at LGBTQ issues, gender issues, colonialism, imperialism. Then we have a tour called the Empire Tour, which is specifically focused on the relationship between the university and empire. And then we have one called the History of Science, which runs out of the Whipple Museum at Cambridge. And our most recent one is called Hidden Histories, and it explores the interaction of women and other marginalized genders and their relationship to the city as well as to the university. So we also have an academic blog where we publish articles that are easy to read and are again informed by the city. We also try to collaborate with local schools, and we've had a number of schools come on our walking tours, and they've been quite well received. We also collaborate with museums. So like I mentioned, the History of Science walk is at the Whipple Museum. And where we've designed and give specialized tours around specific collections, specific interests of the museum itself. Our Empire Tour also touches upon the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology and some of the objects held within it. And we also collaborate with the Museum of Cambridge for research and project applications. We've also worked with certain heritage organizations like the National Trust and AHRC, where with the National Trust, we've been involved in the training of their staff to give more sensitized tours, to give more sensitized training. And we've also been involved in the training program placements for doctoral students. We've also run tours specifically for fundraising to support local charities, for example, Jimmy's at Cambridge and Solidarity. Could we move on to the next slide? So what's different about Uncomfortable Cambridge, Uncomfortable Oxford, and Uncomfortable York walking tours with regard to other walking tours that you might encounter is that we have a discussion-based approach, which means that we invite comments and inputs from the public. So we pose a question and then we sort of ask for their input about certain, well, historical moments, something that's in front of them, a site, something that they might have studied in school and how it differs from what's happening currently around us. So there are different ways we try to sort of invite these comments and inputs from the public. Our approach is educational in the sense that we have very well researched tours written by academics who are experts in their own field, and then we go on to train our guides to deliver those tours so as to make this research accessible to a wider audience in order for these conversations to not remain within university spaces, but also percolate into the outside world. So we try to break down those barriers between the institution and community, between people of different opinions about subjects that might be seen as controversial. We encourage people to critically analyze the material that we present before them. We equip participants with tools to analyze their environments and then further reproduce those conversations with others, families, and friends. And yeah, that's a little bit about our approach. And could we move on to the next slide? So one of the questions that we're engaged with is how to produce a productive engagement on these uncomfortable subjects. One of the problems that we face is, of course, that it is difficult to have a conversation when people are emotionally attached to specific histories. And our goal is then to stimulate a productive engagement on those uncomfortable subjects, create space for critical discussions which aren't inflammatory, and navigating emotional responses to intellectual topics. We champion a pro-dialogue approach versus versus division and or avoidance. And that's how we sort of try to navigate the space of the discussion-based tour. We try to talk about how knowledge is co-produced. We try to question powerful statements. We try to ask our participants to engage with the question of who tells history itself and how that might have an influence on the telling of history. That's one of the first questions that we ask on our walk. Do you believe this statement, and why or why not would you agree to this, to this fact that we've sort of presented before you? We try to anticipate controversy and prepare. One of the things that we do before we begin the walking tour is try to tell people that this is a discussion and not a debate that has to be won. It's a dialogue. It's trying to make something happen in that space of the conversation rather than ask someone to sort of be right or wrong. Of course, we can't prepare or anticipate all controversies. But in my experience, largely they've all gone rather peacefully. I think there have been, of course, uncomfortable moments for us as guides as well, where at some moments when you do bring up something that is uncomfortable for the participant, they might challenge you, but you sort of learn to respond to that, or you learn to put another question so that it never becomes a challenge. It just becomes a space for more conversation to sort of develop. Yeah. So I'm gonna run you through a quick stop in our on our empire tour, in the hope that it might be of interest. I just wanted to check on time, if I'm okay with time.
Perfectly
Okay.
Okay. Amazing. Thank you. So as you can see, we've named it case study 1, and it's actually one of the first stops on our empire tour at St. John's College Chapel, and it has to do with the memory of abolition. So is it okay if I make it a little participative? Would people be willing to? And if you're familiar with Cambridge, maybe would you be willing to sort of test this out, even though we're just sitting in our respective rooms?
We could have responses on the Q&A chat.
Yeah, I mean, I can't see it because I've minimized it, but okay, maybe I'll just talk about it and then I can come back to the questions. Okay, so we start this stop often with the question of what do you know about the process of abolition? And people then give in their responses. If there are people who've maybe studied in the UK, we ask them if they were taught about abolition in school, and they give, again, their responses to that. And based on that, we try to talk about how the narrative of abolition is framed around certain key voices who spoke out against slavery on moral grounds and fought for many years to have it abolished. So why we stop in front of St. John's College is because we have William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson, both of whom graduated from St. John's and who are important figures in the abolition movement. And St. John's Chapel in particular has a statue of Clarkson on the outside, and it has a statue of William Wilberforce within the chapel. And this is a 19th century chapel, so it was built after abolition. Both Clarkson and William Wilberforce also has streets named after them in Cambridge, is something that we also point participants to. And then once we've done that, we ask them who and what is left out of this narrative. So yeah, so that's kind of what we ask them. People will respond saying women, people of color, and that's kind of what we're trying to sort of point towards, that there are people who are left out of the narrative of the memory of abolition. We talk about Eric Williams, who wrote something called Capitalism and Slavery. And he writes that, and this is, I'm quoting him, he writes, British historians write almost as if Britain had introduced slavery solely for the satisfaction of abolishing it. That always brings out some kind of laughter at that point. And then we try to then introduce a fellow abolitionist of William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson called Equiano. Ulada Equiano, and how he has links to Cambridgeshire, has links to Cambridge, but is not commemorated in the same way that either William Wilberforce or Thomas Clarkson are. And we talk about how we know a lot about the life of Equiano because he actually published an autobiography in 1789. And since we're also talking about, like, you know, how a lot of the built environment of the city acts as, you know, like a repository of memory of the city, of global events. We also point to, that's why we point to the statues and the naming of the roads and this absence of Equiano, which then becomes stark. And then we sort of talk about Equiano's life and his relationship to Cambridgeshire. And we also then point to how it's only in October 2022, in fact, 31st October 2022. So it's just been a little over a year, where there was a bridge called Riverside in Cambridge, and it was colloquially called the Tesco Bridge because it was very close to a very big Tesco, and it was renamed Equiano Bridge. So that's the first sort of memorialization of Equiano that we have in Cambridgeshire. And we also point towards some facts about Equiano's life and his relationship. To Cambridgeshire. So in February 2022, for example, the Soham Town Council asked residents on a Facebook post whether they would like a statue of Equiano. The majority of respondents said no, arguing that they would rather commemorate figures with stronger connections to Soham, dissuading the council from progressing any further with the idea. This is even after Equiano actually married a woman from Soham. So there's this strange way in which people with strong connections to a space are still left out of the conversation, and you know there's maybe a need to ask why, and that's something that we try to point people towards, and point to people towards that sort of built environment and absence of commemorating certain figures from very prominent movements. And could we move on to the next slide? This is another one that we have in the Market Square in Cambridge. On this, it's a South African war memorial that you often wouldn't see because it's actually kind of hidden behind a lot of dustbins. So it's quite an unpleasant stop, in fact, to stop near on a windy day because it's quite smelly. But apart from that, this stop actually offers us an opportunity to ask about the many kinds of colonialisms that exist within the memory of a city. This is, of course, from the South African Boer War, which happened between 1889 and 1902, and it was unveiled during a great memorial ceremony in 1905. And it was a war between British settlers and Dutch settlers. And it was a highly controversial war, especially because of the presence of concentration camps. So Britain won the war and incarcerated a lot of the Dutch settlers. And a lot of the outrage was because Dutch women and children were incarcerated in those camps. But the massive death toll that also took place within the South African, like the Black South African community who sided with the Dutch settlers, is not accounted for, and their numbers were never counted in the official death toll. And that's something that we try to sort of talk about, the importance of intersectionality and nuance in these debates, while also acknowledging that a significant number of lives were lost, and this memorial does hold meaning to local families. So it's not to say that this memorial has no value or worth, but it's also to think about the global kind of network of colonialism that it points towards, and how certain lives then become more valued over others. Yeah, and I think that's largely the end of it. And I think we can move on to the next slide, which is the last slide. And all we're asking you to do is, if you want to know more about the work that we do or the organization, you're welcome to follow us on our social media channels, which are all mentioned on that last slide. So thank you.
Thank you, Ranjini. Thank you very much. We will now head to Mahnoor's presentation. Mahnoor, are you here with us?
Yes, I am. You guys can hear me, right?
Great. So
Great.
Mahnoor's topic today will be the trail not taken, analyzing formal and informal tours in Lahore, Pakistan. Mahnoor, would you like to try if you can share your screen?
Sure, let me
Great.
do that.
Great.
Great. Everybody can see my screen?
Okay, the floor is yours then.
Great. So hello everyone. I'm going to be talking about informal tour narratives in Lahore, Pakistan. So now my issue is in this study is that when you're assessing the possibility of creating a heritage tour or any kind of museum dedicated to heritage spaces, you kind of look towards the West very often, or regulations that are created by UNESCO or the World Monuments Fund. However, I found within the literature there was a gap that ignored the intricacies of the Global South and really what happened in our post-colonial reality. I don't think that is often spoken about, and that there is a huge downside with that, is that there's a lack of local representation, and there are sites, and you don't really feature within the wider colonialist narrative there or nationalist narrative. There are sites that are omitted that feature more alternate histories, more difficult histories, or uncomfortable histories. And those sites themselves are, under constant threat of extinction. So Pakistan sits at a really interesting crossroads in historic preservation discourse, because here we have a country that has very little heritage protection policy, but a very strong desire to promote heritage as a form of tourism. And in these recent years, there's been a shift of locals who feel like the narratives that are portrayed to the outside world or in tourism are not reflective of local realities that feel more authentic to our lived experiences of these cities. And in Pakistan's case, that's the lack of representation with Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jainist, and even Jewish sites that are omitted from memory. And that kind of frustration that's been building up has led to citizens taking up informal tours as a way to bring about more inclusive heritage, as a way of bringing about more active political heritage. And, I think that there is a lot of leeway, or a lot of, there's a lot that can be said for heritage preservation in the future that is more conscious of our social realities. And one important way to study how communities are engaging with these local nuanced histories that I talked about are through these informal tourist tours that are conceptualized and executed by members of the public. Now, they're not led by the state, so they don't have nationalist objectives, or they're not market-oriented, but they're really citizen-led. Many of them are not, they don't make much of a profit, but they really feel like it is their duty to talk about history that has been omitted from our nationalist narratives that have been told for so many years. And many of these organizers are citizens, they're architects, they're students, they use social media to organize and document historic mansions, monuments, and public spaces. So, right. My study really shows how informal tour spaces can be a place of inclusion and dialogue about post-colonial realities that seeks to undermine that simplistic nationalist nature of our current narratives. And it's more inward-looking, it's a community-built project, and it really shows how informal tours can be vehicles of community engagement and documentation in this current post-pandemic social media era. And the target study will be informal or private groups of concerned citizens within Lahore who wish to implement such a method to create more awareness for their communities. So when we start off, we're going to start with the city of Lahore itself for those who are not acquainted. So the city of Lahore, it is the second largest city in Pakistan. It's considered our cultural hub, founded 2,000 years ago on the banks of the river. And because of its location right between Afghanistan and India, it became a sort of thoroughfare for major empires that have been, jostling for power in what is now called South Asia. And within all this, the walled city, or the Purana Shahar, the old city, was once the fortified city center. But now it's part of an urban sprawl, and it's really governed by its own authority called the Walled City of Lahore. And I do want to say, we're talking about the history of Lahore, there's an Indian cultural critic, Meenakshi Mukherjee, who remarked that institutions or infrastructures like museums or monuments, they're colonial creations, they're not indigenous methods of collective remembrance. Then how then do these practices of heritage and documentation become so deeply embedded in our understanding of a national remembrance? So when something happens, we'll make a museum out of it, we'll make a monument out of it, even though it may or may not be indigenous to the area. And the real start is that the idea of documentation or collection, categorization, the supremacy of European values, they kind of came into our understanding of our urban spaces. For the colonialists, if you look into the archive, preservation was never an end goal. It was more of something that just kind of happened. The end goal has always been to categorize or to document or to survey the area and really create a typography that has very clear binaries of what is considered the good, clean, organized city versus what is the evil, dark, exotic, what have you kind of city. And there's so many examples of people there's a report from 1863 that concluded that the habits of the natives are such that unless they're closely watched, they cover the whole neighboring surface with filth. And it's this kind of dual mentality, this kind of Orientalism that comes in that's grotesque, but it's also appealing, that's really colors the walled city. And that lack of interest in preservation kind of carries forward into, post-partition, where it's not about preservation anymore. It's about creating that new reality. It's about creating a completely new typography, but one that is more associated with the nationalist project rather than the colonialist project. And I am jumping, and please, if you have questions, I will be able to answer them. But our story comes in the modern era where, this old city is being used as a kind of tourist area, or it's largely forgotten as an urban center, but it's mostly a sort of fortified, like Corbusier's idea of the Kasbah, which is just, it should be fossilized or used for tourist purposes, not functional purposes. And now we introduce the formal tour. So like I mentioned, the WCLA is the regulatory body. It's the first of its kind, established in 2012 by the government of Punjab, and it is the only historic district in the city. And as you can see in the images, they've created these sort of packages and these royal trails through the walled city between one gate to another. Right now, package 1 in purple is mostly being used, and the WCLA have tried to create more packages, but unfortunately there's been a lot of pushback from the local trader communities who use this as a functional space, and we can talk about that as well. And so even in package 1, you have city by night tours, you have the royal trails, which sort of takes you back to the steps of the royal Mughal emperors, breakfast tours, there are fancy rickshaws. And the whole reason why preservation happened in this area was for tourist purposes. So the Al Khan Development Network came in and they started in, I think, about 2007, and they sort of used this as a pilot project for future heritage projects in the city, focusing on preservation and tourism, particularly the Mughal era. Now I ask, what are the gaps in this narrative and who benefits from these gaps in the first place? Now, the goal of my study is that it aims to look at how informal tours are spaces for preservation dialogues that can lead to inclusions of alternate narratives in cities and contentious histories. Lahore, if anybody knows, has tons of contentious history. Like I said, it was a thoroughfare for major empires, so it is littered with layers upon layers of history, and you can physically see the distinctions between the cities. But how are you going to, create a narrative that is not a straight linear narrative, but is more inclusive of, the multiplicity and the contention and the discomfort? So my objective with this study was to define and create a typology of formal and informal tours in Lahore. I will explain what that means in a bit. And objective 2 is to understand how exactly they are vehicles of community engagement, preservation, and documentation. What is the work that is already being done? And my objective 3 is to outline the most important issues faced by the organizers when creating and executing informal tours. What are the drawbacks and what is the pushback, especially from the local community? And I want to introduce, this project is not just my project. These are, they're great people and they continue to do great work, even right now. So you've got Taimur Khan Mumtaz. He does these sort of guided tours talking about architecture and Islam. You've got Faizan Naqvi, who expressly talks about the non-Muslim history of the city. Tahir Azani Malik he's created more of a house museum, but still has been really, really important in reaching out to the communities and creating a kind of pluralistic dialogue. You have Lahore Sangat, which they are doing plaques now on the houses of famous artists and writers and dancers to create a sort of spatial map of who lived next to who are neighbors, and they are also doing work by themselves. And then lastly, you have Harun Khalid. He's a great writer. He talks about non-Muslim history within Lahore. And he also especially focuses on Sikh history within Lahore and Punjab as a whole. So now looking at my literature review, for those who are interested, I was really interested. The key terms that stuck out to me when doing this literature review was the embodied tourism, alternative tourism, community-led tourism, dark tourism. They all have very different definitions. They're a little nuanced, but they more or less mean, tourism narratives that will show something that's a little different. So we have tourism as ethnographic investigation. We have some post-colonial theory going on, and then we have ideas of authenticity in a post-colonial world, which exclusively features, this part of my literature review features South Asian writers on purpose, because I needed to see in my study what South Asians were writing about within their own authenticity. And then you have the baseline UNESCO framework of what tourism is supposed to mean. So one that respects the local people, the traveler, the cultural heritage. It is exciting and educational. There is very little room for discomfort in UNESCO's framework of tours. So, right, now the moment we've been waiting for, my definition of what a formal versus informal tour is. So a formal tour, which in this case is the WCLA's own tours, they're licensed, they're regulated by a government body, they have very rigid programming, and they're often for commercial purposes. So you see this tourist rickshaw in the picture, and it's really, you don't see rickshaws like these, but they've been created and fabricated to bring about a certain air. versus the informal tour, which is a non-licensed tour by an expert or an enthusiast with very flexible programming. And it's often storytelling, it's a lot of discussion, and it's mostly for activist purposes. And the common thread between both of these are the audiences. So within my study, I've seen domestic tourists come to both tours, foreign commercial tourists who mostly prefer the formal tour, researchers and diaspora who are looking for their ancestral homelands in the informal tours. And really the formal and the informal tour often cater to their audience. And a lot of them are special, like bespoke tours that happen within the city based on what the client or the audience requires. So if you look at my table of contents for my study, and if anybody's interested in reading this, I can send it over. As I mentioned, the history of colonialism and how preservation or heritage was seen in India, in Lahore at the time, versus what is now happening and how heritage is being seen in the current day. Then I do a sort of deep dive into the different formal and informal state tours, the locals, the extent of the local participation, local as in people who actually live in the walled city. What exactly they do within their narrative, so the methods of narrative building. I'll talk about that a little more later. And then, some recommendations of possible future programming. So in my methodology, I really wanted to do, because I feel so close to my topic and I've seen the development of heritage go, I really wanted to do an autoethnography, which is sort of, you twist the idea of the traditional ethnography by using your own internal experiences and beliefs and practices to see the world. And it's a sort of inward-looking, analytical view of, what have I been taking for granted? What are the things that I missed when I walked through the walled city? And it acknowledges that I have a huge bias in this, and I have a huge stake in this. And the people I speak to are human beings who continue to have a stake in this, after I've written my paper. So it's really an acknowledgement of all of that going forward. And I had these conversations, and so the process is the most important than the end goal. And it really it balances the intellectual and methodological rigor with creativity and sort of, doing something unconventional. And then that autoethnography is bolstered by discussions that I had with all of these informal tourist groups that I spoke to. And I had questions, I had guided conversations, I took part in some of their tours, and then I tried my best to corroborate the stories and the narratives they told with archival data versus, what they're saying versus what's being said. And when you look at the methods of narrative building, there are three main points stuck out to me, is how they complicate the narrative by acknowledging the diverse traditions in the city. So on the top right, you have this South Asian academic, Dr. Ali Usman Kasmi. He did a whole virtual tour of Lahore reimagined as a Hindu city. So within the nationalist framework, Lahore cannot be seen as anything but a Mughal Muslim city. However, these guys have created an archive and a walking tour with key figures, key sites that have been really, really important to Lahore's history as a Hindu city. And when they do that, they sort of break that conventional linear narrative that we're talking about by offering alternative heroes and alternative sites that are of equal importance to the end goal of what happened, which was partition. And then they localize that narrative. Instead of creating something that's very general, very national, it's very local. And it includes local heroes or people that, they recognize. And finally, they use storytelling and alternative visuals as a way of sort of creating political action. So very quickly, between the statue of Ranjit Singh that they put out, that the WCLA put up, Ranjit Singh was a Sikh ruler who ruled Lahore, and the government tried to sort of shoehorn him into Mughal spaces as a sort of way of creating diversity and tokenization. But because it came so out of the, out of the community, it there are repeated vandalizing efforts, and the statue no longer exists there because people will simply not let it pass. Versus when you look at Bhagat Singh was an anti-colonialist dissident. He protested. He was a revolutionary, and his appreciation came from within the people themselves. It was the people that kind of demanded the government take him seriously. And as a result, while you have the Ranjit Singh figure vandalized, you have Bhagat Singh being celebrated every single day because it's something that came organically from the locals who believe in the story of Bhagat Singh. And that, whereas Ranjit Singh was sort of a symbol of government and power and oppression, Bhagat Singh was more of the people, and he's sort of a martyrdom figure in Lahore. And so finally, those are some of the examples that I found speaking to people within my own experience. But finally, my recommendations moving forward is to really activate the old city as a public space because it is traditional. Public space and public speaking is an indigenous tradition that we can continue on if we allow widespread tour programming. Sometimes that can be in the digital space, sometimes that can involve the school curriculum, but really it is to get people interested in the idea of creating their own walking tours and bringing that enthusiasm to find their own histories that speak interest to them. Who are their heroes? Who are their villains? It really more widespread encouragement of creating different stories besides what is being told. And finally, using the virtual space for marketing and tour programming. So there are existing networks of mobilization and advocacy. Audit March is really big too. For example, it's the Women's March that happens once a year in Pakistan. And so I proposed an idea of doing a walking tour of Audit March featuring the Women's March, featuring key places where women have protested in the past and the present. And I did speak to the organizers, and we'll see if something can come up. And again, it's completely citizen-led, it's civilian-oriented, and there's no commercialization. It's really for a kind of awareness. Walking tours and tourism go hand in hand, especially in cities that are marked by traumatic moments and silence narratives. And then in attempting to uncover those narratives, those neglected spaces are part of a citizen-led preservation as a kind of advocacy that could translate into new solidarities and awareness. And it's vital for me as a researcher to not just write about them theoretically, but to go on them and to create them and to embody them as an ethnographic study that contextualizes walking with citizen-led initiatives. And, nationalist rhetoric is very, very deeply entrenched in our society. It's very difficult to undo the horrors of partition, through just one walking tour. But to understand the process of documentation and storytelling, it allows people to gain awareness of these spaces and to build an attachment to these stories and, determine the preservation of the city that is, in a way, more authentic to what the state would propose. And that's what really interested me, and that's the work that I had been doing, and that's me.
Thank you very much. Thank you both.